My daughter, Emily, was born with a disability that required her to use a wheelchair. Despite the challenges, she's always been a bright, cheerful little girl. She loves spending time outside, playing with the other kids, and feeling like she's part of the community. I've always made sure that her needs were met: accessible ramps, a wheelchair-friendly vehicle, and plenty of support at home. But when we moved into this seemingly peaceful neighborhood, I never imagined the trouble we'd face from the HOA. At first, everything seemed perfect. The neighbors were friendly, and the community had a good vibe. Emily made friends quickly, and I was happy with our new home. But as time went on, I began to notice the HOA's increasing involvement in everyone's personal business. They started sending out rules and regulations that seemed trivial at best, but they were enforced with such seriousness it was hard to ignore. Karen, the president of the HOA, was the most vocal about every little thing. She often made a point to remind people of the rules, even if they were unnecessary. She was one of those people who believed that the neighborhood had to look perfect, no matter who or what was actually living in it. And when it came to Emily and her wheelchair, it became clear that Karen had a problem. It started with small comments, passing remarks about Emily's wheelchair being unsightly or in the way. I thought at first it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe Karen didn't fully understand the challenges that come with a disability, and I was willing to be patient. But as time went on, I began to feel that Karen's comments weren't about being helpful. They were about making Emily feel like she didn't belong here. Karen's passive-aggressive behavior escalated, and that's when the real trouble began. At first, Karen's remarks were small and isolated, but over time, they became more frequent and more invasive. I'd find notes in my mailbox from the HOA reminding me to adjust the height of the lawn or paint the fence a more neutral color. But what really set me off was when I received a notice that Emily's wheelchair ramp, which I had installed to make our home more accessible, was supposedly a violation of the HOA's aesthetic standards. I couldn't believe it. My daughter's basic need for mobility was now being scrutinized by the very people who were supposed to be helping maintain a welcoming community. The ramp was clearly necessary for Emily's independence, and it was designed to be as unobtrusive as possible. Still, Karen and the HOA had found a way to make it seem like a problem. When I confronted Karen about the complaint, she gave me a smile that was anything but friendly. "We just want the neighborhood to look nice," she said, adjusting her glasses as if she were offering me a simple piece of advice. "There's a certain standard we have to uphold. You know," I stared at her, not believing my ears. "This is my daughter's wheelchair ramp. Are you seriously telling me that my daughter's access to her own home is something you're willing to compromise?" I asked, trying to stay calm but feeling my blood pressure rise. Karen, of course, remained unfazed. "I'm just saying it would be much better if you could make it blend in with the neighborhood more. It's just about appearances." My frustration boiled over, but I held back. I knew I had to keep my cool. I was a sheriff, trained to handle difficult people. But Karen's attitude, this dismissive, insensitive, and frankly cruel stance, was starting to get under my skin. Despite my protests, the HOA kept sending new requests and complaints. First, it was the ramp, then it was the placement of Emily's wheelchair in the driveway. It seemed like everything I did for my daughter was now under the scrutiny of Karen and the HOA board. They were nitpicking things that weren't even issues, all while pretending that their actions were about maintaining standards in the neighborhood. It was clear now, Karen wasn't just concerned with aesthetics. She was actively trying to make our lives harder, and it felt personal. She didn't want people like Emily in her perfect little world. As weeks passed, Karen's behavior became increasingly hostile and direct. It wasn't just about the minor complaints anymore. Karen had made it clear that she didn't want people like Emily living in the neighborhood. I had hoped the HOA would eventually focus on actual issues, but instead, it seemed like every day brought another ridiculous complaint about my family. One day, I was outside working in the yard while Emily played on the front lawn. She loved being outside, and I loved watching her interact with the neighborhood kids. But Karen, walking past with her small dog, stopped in her tracks and glared at Emily. "Your daughter is a disruption," she said loudly, her voice carrying in the quiet of the afternoon. I felt the sting of her words even before I could respond. Emily, who had been giggling with a few kids nearby, stopped and looked up confused. "What are you talking about?" I asked, stepping toward her. Karen continued, her tone condescending. "She's taking up too much space on the sidewalk. People have to walk around her wheelchair. It's not safe, and it's not appropriate for a community like ours. I could feel the anger rising in my chest. My daughter is not a disruption, Karen, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She has every right to be here, just like anyone else in this neighborhood. Karen shrugged, unfazed. I'm just saying some people's needs are more difficult to accommodate. Maybe it's better if she plays in the backyard, out of sight. We don't want to make others uncomfortable. The audacity of her words was breathtaking. Emily, who had been smiling moments before, now looked down at her hands, her face falling as she processed what Karen had said. It broke my heart to see her, my brave, joyful daughter, hurt by someone she had never wronged. Karen's words were more than just about my daughter. They were about Karen's belief that she had the power to dictate who belonged and who didn't. And in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't just fighting for Emily's right to live in this neighborhood. I was fighting for her dignity and for her right to exist without fear of being singled out or belittled by someone like Karen. But Karen wasn't done. She walked off, her smug expression leaving behind a growing knot of anger in my chest. I took a deep breath, swallowing the fury that had built up. I wasn't going to let this go. Not for Emily. Not for me. The tension with Karen had been building for weeks, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. It was a typical Saturday morning when it all escalated. I was working in the garage, putting away some tools, and Emily was playing outside, enjoying the sunshine. Her laughter was like music to my ears, and I took a moment to breathe, feeling thankful for the peaceful moment. But that peace was soon shattered by a knock on the door. I walked over and opened it, only to find two men standing on my porch, wearing ill-fitting uniforms and carrying what looked like official-looking badges. Before I could say anything, one of them spoke. "We're here from the HOA," he said, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We've been instructed to seize the wheelchair. It doesn't comply with HOA guidelines." I blinked, unable to comprehend what I was hearing. "Excuse me? What are you talking about? You can't seize my daughter's wheelchair. It's essential for her to get around." The man, with an air of authority, glanced at his partner before turning back to me. "It's been deemed unsightly and out of line with the aesthetic standards of the community. We've been instructed by the board to take it." I felt my blood run cold. This was it, the point where Karen's overreach had crossed into something much more sinister. She wasn't just trying to control how my family lived. She was now actively trying to take something my daughter needed for survival. "You are not taking that wheelchair," I said firmly, standing my ground. I knew what was coming next. The anger in my chest was rising. These men had no legal right to remove my daughter's wheelchair, and they knew it. "We're just following orders," the second man said, clearly uncomfortable, but still stepping forward. "It's for the good of the community." "That's not how this works," I snapped. "You don't have the authority to do this, and you're crossing a line." Before they could respond, I stepped back inside the house, grabbed my phone, and called for backup. As a sheriff, I knew exactly what to do in situations like this. I wasn't going to let two fake HOA cops intimidate me or threaten my daughter's well-being. I wasn't just a father, this was personal, and it was time to end Karen's reign of control. I walked back outside, phone in hand, and faced the two men, who were now looking uneasy. "I'm County Sheriff, your last name," I said, my voice calm but with an unmistakable edge. "And if you think for 1 second that you're going to take anything from my daughter, you made a huge mistake." The two men froze, their eyes widening as they realized who they were dealing with. They had no idea that the person they had been trying to intimidate was someone with the authority to expose them for what they were, frauds. The two fake HOA enforcers stood there, stunned by my words. For a moment, there was a heavy silence, broken only by the distant sounds of children playing and birds chirping, an eerie contrast to the tension hanging in the air. I could see their nervous glances as they took in my sheriff's badge, now clearly visible on my shirt. "You made a mistake," I said, my voice steady and controlled, though inside I was seething. "I'm County Sheriff, your last name, and you have no right to be here." The two men looked at each other, clearly thrown off guard. They hadn't expected this, weren't prepared to face someone with the authority to not only call the shots but also to take action. They had been so sure of their ability to intimidate a family they thought would back down. They were wrong. "You're not doing anything without authorization," I continued, stepping closer. "And I suggest you leave now." The first man tried to recover, clearing his throat. We were just doing our job. We were told by the HOA." No, I cut him off sharply. What you're doing is illegal. You're impersonating official authority, and I'm sure Karen didn't explain to you that what you're doing is a federal violation. You can't just take something that belongs to my daughter. The second man shifted uneasily, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation was unfolding. We didn't know, sir. We thought we were just following instructions. Did you check if those instructions were legal? I asked, my eyes narrowing. Did Karen even tell you what she was asking you to do was lawful? Because if she didn't, you just walked into a very serious problem. I could see the panic set in as the two men exchanged worried looks. They were beginning to understand that they were in way over their heads. They weren't dealing with an average resident. They were dealing with someone who knew the law inside and out, someone who had the power to make sure they faced consequences for their actions. I pulled out my phone again and dialed for backup, ready to document the situation. I'm calling the police to report this, I said coldly, and when I do, I'll be making sure this gets reported to every local and federal authority involved. You're not getting away with this. The first man began to back off, his confidence crumbling. We didn't mean to cause trouble. We were just doing what Karen said. Then you should have asked more questions, I said, my tone final. You violated my daughter's rights, and you'll be held accountable for it. The situation had gone from tense to critical. As the backup officers arrived, the real authority in the situation was firmly established. The fake HOA enforcers were quickly separated from the protagonist, each of them being questioned by law enforcement. It became clear that they had no legal right to be acting on behalf of the HOA, and they were not official agents of any governing body. I stood off to the side, watching as the officers took control. One officer walked over to me, nodding in understanding. You did the right thing calling this in, he said, looking at the two men. These guys are in deep trouble. As I stood there, I couldn't help but think about how this could have ended if I hadn't been there. The men had no idea who they were trying to intimidate. More than just violating a family's rights, they had come dangerously close to causing real harm by attempting to seize Emily's wheelchair, something she needed for her independence. I couldn't let that slide, not for 1 second. The officer who had been speaking with the enforcers turned to face me, his expression serious. These two are in violation of federal law for starters, he said, taking out his notebook to make a record. They're impersonating public officials and trying to steal someone's personal property. You're looking at charges for assault, theft, and child endangerment, among other things. I nodded, knowing exactly how serious this was. The men were being cuffed and read their rights. There would be consequences for their actions, and I was glad to see that justice was being done. But my thoughts kept circling back to Karen. She had orchestrated all of this, and she needed to be held accountable as well. I'm not letting this go, I said, my voice firm. Karen is the one who gave them these orders. She's the one who needs to be charged for harassment, for instigating this whole mess. The officer nodded. We'll look into that. But for now, we've got enough to move forward. These guys won't be walking away unscathed. As the fake HOA enforcers were loaded into the patrol car, the neighborhood slowly began to return to normal. I could feel the weight of everything that had just happened. My daughter was safe, and the people who tried to take something from her were facing the consequences of their actions. But I knew this wasn't over yet. Karen's influence in the HOA had caused this, and she needed to answer for it. The news of the incident spread through the neighborhood quickly. What had started as an isolated, harrowing moment for my family became a rallying point for the rest of the community. People who had once been passive observers now found their voices, speaking out against the injustice that had been done to Emily and our family. Neighbors who had previously been quiet and uninvolved began stopping by to offer their support. One by one, families came forward with cards, flowers, and messages of solidarity. It was as though the community had been waiting for someone to take a stand, and once the incident unfolded, they realized it was time to act. Emily, though still shaken, smiled when she saw the outpouring of love and kindness. It was clear that despite what had happened, the neighborhood was united in supporting her. The HOA, however, was not so united. In the wake of the scandal, more and more residents started to speak out against Karen and the other members of the board. It didn't take long for the HOA's influence to begin unraveling. Many residents, like me, realized that the HOA was not serving the community. It was serving Karen's vision of a perfect neighborhood, one where people like Emily didn't belong. The more people shared their experiences, the clearer it became that Karen's actions had created an environment of fear and exclusion. A few days later, the HOA board called an emergency meeting, but it was clear the damage had already been done. Karen's leadership was no longer tenable, and the board members who had supported her began distancing themselves from her actions. I attended the meeting, sitting quietly in the back, knowing the moment was approaching. When Karen's name was called, she was met with a chorus of complaints, not just from me, but from several neighbors who had finally found the courage to speak up. There were accusations of bullying, discrimination, and the misuse of HOA powers. Karen tried to defend herself, but the more she spoke, the more evident it became that her reign over the HOA was over. She was removed from her position as president, and a motion was passed to completely overhaul the HOA's leadership. The community, once divided, was now rallying behind a new vision, one that was inclusive, kind, and free from the oppressive control that Karen had tried to impose. The new HOA board worked to rebuild the neighborhood's trust, ensuring that no one, especially those with disabilities, would ever feel unwelcome again. For us, the road to recovery wasn't immediate, but we felt a shift in the air. Emily, now more confident than ever, was no longer afraid to play outside or go to neighborhood events. The once stifling fear and tension that had shadowed her and me began to fade. The neighborhood had finally learned that no one was above the law, not even someone who thought they controlled the community. And that lesson was one I'd carry with me for a long time. In the end, it wasn't just about winning the battle for Emily's rights. It was about showing the community that standing up for what's right can create real, lasting change.